For everyone with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 3, Episode 20 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami. Our special conversation with Jörn Schattenberg, Louise Campbell, and me starts now. Today, on a special Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
If I don't know who to treat, and I treat everybody, my response rate is 20%, and then you have an endpoint that's shaky at times or has some uncertainties, so that's maybe an indication that carries risk. But today, we are in a much better position to actually find the relevant subgroups, so it's not 30% of the population, it's the 1% of the population that have advanced disease, that develop endpoints, relevant endpoints that are detrimental for the patients, and these need treatment, and these endpoints can be prevented if you have a drug that's efficacious.
Your body thought your liver was so important, it was the only organ that regenerates. It's got live in the title. And we just keep it simple. Going back to Stephen's keep it simple, stupid, let's bring it down to basics. It is the only organ that our bodies, when we were genetically developed, was made to regenerate. But that's actually in there lies the problems that we have in getting a liquid biopsy with new tissue, with the way it works. It's not designed to show us it's got a problem. So we do have to go hunting slightly for that needle in the haystack.
One of the phrases I use a lot on this podcast is that people do what's inspected, not what's expected. So it becomes easy to treat diabetes if what you're going for is glycohemoglobin lowering. And it becomes easy to treat dyslipidemias if you know that LDL is really what you're looking at. It becomes easier to treat things where you've got simple target metrics. And by the way, part of the nature of sensing, judging personality types is give me a data point. Give me the data point that tells me what I need to know. So I think one of the problems that the liver has had is that there is no data point.
Get to know new regular key opinion leader Jörn Schattenberg, his background and hepatology passions and perspective as he joins Louise Campbell and Roger Green to discuss all that plus his aspirations for the podcast on this special, single interview edition of Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
Для всіх, хто цікавиться мережею NASH або загалом жировою хворобою печінки, ловіть хвилю.
Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to thank, again, our friend Anna Tokar for doing such a nice job of translating our opening line into Ukrainian so that I don't have to mangle pronunciation on a word-by-word basis. And as with previous weeks and future weeks, our thoughts and our hopes and our prayers with people of the Ukraine as they deal with this horrible situation in which they find themselves.
Hi, it's Roger. Welcome to our special Tuesday night interview episode. Actually, there are a few things about this episode that are different. I'll give you a little bit of the story why, and then you can sit back and listen and enjoy. When Jörn came on as full-time surfer, one of the things I learned was that we would not be able to record a normal episode this week. I go into that at the beginning of the next conversation. So we decided instead to do a series of interviews with some of our favorite people. We did a long interview with Jörn about his coming on board and telling folks a little more about his history. So you get to know him a little better before you listen to him every week. And then we were fortunate enough to get Donna Cryer, Naeem Al-Khoury, Lars Johansson, three favorites of ours, and Mike Patel, the head of the One Patient Advocacy Organization in North America, leading patient advocacy organization for fatty liver in North America, the Fatty Liver Alliance, that we never had on the podcast. Mike came on and joined me as well. Well, then the gremlins struck. We couldn't download Mike's episode. Lars's episode we could kind of download, but the sound quality was so bad we really couldn't use it. What we decided to do was to put out a special Tuesday night episode just featuring the interview with Louise and Jörn and me, which you'll hear now. And then tomorrow night, the conversations with Donna and Naeem, which are each exciting and newsmaking in their own regard. So sit back, listen, enjoy this conversation with Jörn. Afterwards, you'll get a simple wrap-up from Grace, our voiceover person, and then we will be back tomorrow with a full episode. Enjoy.
So we're here right now, just the three of us, Louise and Jörn and me, the new three of us. When Stephen is with us, will be the four of us. But I figured since you got to know, audience got to know Louise and me pretty well over the life of the first year and a half, 2 years of the podcast. And Jörn's been with us a bunch. I didn't do the exact count, but I think it's over 30 episodes at this point, but not every week. Just wanted to take some time for everyone to get to know Jörn a little bit as we do. He was introduced to me by Stephen Harrison as the nicest guy in hepatology. By the way, Ken Kusi was introduced to me is the nicest guy in endocrinology. And I think so far, over the last couple of years, you guys have been each holding up your ends of the bargain and also really smart and multidisciplinary. So, Jörn, first of all, I can't tell you how thrilled I am that you're coming aboard full time.
Thanks, Roger. No, the thrill is on my side, really, because I've been following the podcast for some time and really enjoyed the days that I was able to join you. Most of the time, it's a Monday evening and Monday night, and it's really a highlight in the week. I have it as a fixed block in my calendar now, so I'm very excited to move forward with you guys.
So I will tell the audience a funny story, which is one of the things that Jörn joining us on this basis has done is forced me to learn the German holiday calendar. For example, the reason we're recording this week the way we are in part is because Easter Monday is a major holiday in Germany, not in the States, and the major holiday week of the year. So Jörn came aboard this week and then is available all of next week. So we're doing one of our typical Surfing the NASH adaptations, and we're doing a bunch of interviews with people that we've been wanting to catch up with. But in front of that, as I say, a little bit of time with Jörn. So how did you come to hepatology in the first place?
Well, that's a good question. And I have to think some time back because I've been there for some years now. I went to med school after doing the German Abitur, which is the graduation. Actually, I spent part of my high school years in Montana. I might have said that one or the other podcast previously, and that was really a fascinating time. Nothing that really coined me towards med school, but coming out of a family where we do have some physicians, I was used to talking about GI issues over dinner with my father, and it kind of coined me towards medicine, I guess. I went to med school in Maïnz. Maïnz has a fairly big university here, medical program, and trained here both the preclinical, which is the equivalent to the college education, and the clinical parts, which would be the med school, as you know it in the US. One of the typical exercises German med students do is to actually write up a doctoral thesis. And that doctoral thesis coined me towards hepatology, I think, because back in the days, got a new head of the department. He was focused on hepatocellular carcinoma and apoptosis, liver injury mechanisms. I joined the group, started to work at the bench, killing hepatocytes in little plastic dishes. Now, we use different conditions to protect them or foster cell death. And that part that in the end resulted in my promotion, which is the MD degree, kind of coined me towards hepatology. And right after graduating, instead of joining the clinical team and starting residency, I actually went abroad and joined Mark Chaya at Albert Einstein in New York. It's part of the Yeshiva University, and there's the big liver center. It's called Marion Besson Liver Center. Big center at times. David Shefritz, they did a lot of regeneration back then, and I joined the group, and we got into fatty liver disease then, feeding mice, trying to decipher the mechanisms of liver injury, just as I did in my first days in the lab. And really, this is my start in hepatology and NAFLD, even before doing clinical work.
First of all, Louise is with us at midnight in Sydney. Sydney?
Yeah, I'm still in Sydney.
Yeah, midnight in Sydney. She and I are going to alternate questions, in part to keep her awake at this hour, and in part because she'll have better questions than me. But I just want to make one observation, which is my dinner table, we grew up debating politics, which occasionally was vehement, but I think I probably prefer that as a mental image to talking about GI issues every night while eating. For some reason, I understand why that would take you in the direction it did. I'm just, visualizing interesting conversations while eating food. Louise, go ahead. Your question to Professor Schattenberg.
Well, that's a very official title. No, I just love listening to what you bring to the podcast, and I particularly like the angle you bring about sharing with primary care and epidemiology and bringing it out that way. So is that something you particularly foster, or is that something that a lot of your colleagues work with as well?
That's a good comment. And I think, as a physician in a tertiary care center, you kind of think, I'm at the top of the spectrum. I get the sickest of the sick. We're doing the transplants, and really there's a big disconnect to primary care. However, working in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, I think the majority of my patients actually is with these primary care physicians. And it's actually through the research, the more clinical research. I started out detailing some of the bench work and the mice work I've been doing, but it's the clinical research that really connected me to that patient group, because that's where my patients are. And we're doing 2 or 3 big screening projects over here. Liver Screen is an EU-funded consortium that actually goes into the primary care physician's office and screens for liver disease there using different technologies. Really, I think that made me become part of a network here in Maïnz, where I have a very close relation to a lot of the primary care physicians that start to see or realize the amount of patients they're seeing. And I think we're in exchange with them. And it's a very good experience instead of just being isolated in your ivory academic medical center. That's the direction I come from here.
So what can we sort of take from that and share? Because we get a lot of resistance in primary care to wanting to locate, to thinking that they don't see liver disease. So therefore it's obviously not there. So were they receptive at the beginning? Were they reticent? Was there a hesitancy about it?
Yeah, I think there are easy targets and more difficult targets. So one colleague I'm working with very closely trained in GI partly, and she was very receptive to this idea. And she's actually handled a transient elastography device herself before going into primary care. And when I approached her and suggested we're going to use this technology to actually screen in your practice, and she was on fire and did that right away. The limitations for primary care physicians is there's no allotted time to look for liver disease in their busy schedule. There's not at a single point, maybe outside of how are you, if the patient doesn't says, I think I have liver disease, they won't talk about liver disease again. Our co-surfer, Stephen, would have said that you greet him and street him in a couple of minutes. There's really no room to assess liver disease. And all the screening programs they have to do or the regular maintenance, this is a major obstacle. Now that we're improving diagnostics or potentially even bringing in something like artificial intelligence, and we've discussed this here on the podcast, that's run in the background of a medical file that could highlight and flag a patient of suspected liver disease, these type of technologies could be transforming for the primary cares and actually start thinking about liver disease.
Jörn, I'm laughing because as you were starting to describe the lack of time primary care had, the phrase that immediately went through my head was greet him, treat him, and street him. So Stephen's impact on how everyone deals with him speaks is really compelling. But between peek and shriek and greet him, treat him, and street him, you've certainly taken all that stuff and put it right in front of us. So Alina Allen was the first person, I think, who came on this podcast and specifically said, the best use of AI may well be patient records. Exactly what you just referred to, which was a surprise because the question that elicited that was, we expected the answer to be about the work that's being done with histopathology. And her answer was there. In a world where the liquid biopsies are better or better received, how long do you think it will take? Or what path do you see and how long might it take to get to a place where, in the German system at least, you can integrate decent liquid tests and medical records and start doing some of that in the background?
Yeah, so the liquid biopsies require some sort of liquid, right? And this is limited in primary care. For the primary care physician to take a blood drop, it takes a good system. At least in Germany, they're not going to do that. In the NICE system, this is a little different in the setup, but in general, German primary care physicians will not do regular lab tests. Now, this is not true for physicians caring for patients with diabetes, where there are specialized diabetes programs, for example, disease management programs. And there, based on quality criteria and reassurance, blood tests are suggested. And I think there are certain programs that are already existing in the German medical arena or healthcare system that fatty liver disease or liver disease as such should piggyback on and then be addressed. It'll take some time to implement that, and you need some political discussion around it because it might be a few additional expenses. But in general, the system is ready to implement that in a high-risk population within those disease management programs for diabetes.
So, and when that happens, do you expect that FIB4 will be the blood test that comes in? Since it's the one that one of the things I'm trying to figure out in my mind, and I'm not going to be quick enough to get this right, and I hadn't thought about it before this moment, is what is the value of a test that's inefficient in identifying positives in a 70% positive population?
Yeah, well, that test doesn't have a very high value, I'd say. It generates a lot of costs because you have false positives or false negatives, and that's a problem. So I'm understanding your question with regards to diagnostic. Would it be a blood-based test or would it be an imaging test? I mean, this is something we've discussed on and off. The liquid biopsy themes, blood-based testing will be a little bit easier in the context of high-volume populations. If you have populations at very high risk and you can identify them well, I think imaging would probably be handy to be implemented, but the volume of imaging will never be as high as you could offer with blood-based testing.
One more question, then, Louise, I'm going to hand it back to you. So I wonder then maybe if that's where AI comes into play, right? If you've got decent AI in medical records so that you can increase the probability of a positive result, then it might be more efficient to go to a 5-minute MRE if you have that available to you. Or if you didn't, to go to transient elastography, then to go to blood-based, even if you're already drawing blood, because the blood tests aren't predictive enough. Although the NIS4 numbers that we saw with, I guess it was litmus, were actually pretty compelling, if I remember correctly.
I agree, but we come back to the AI theme. I do see this as an enrichment and at-risk definition tool, so not as a diagnostic tool. It will never establish the diagnosis, but it will enrich the population or exclude certain patients. And the reason why Alina mentioned this should be done in medical records and primary care is because there the delta to the current situation is the biggest, because it's not done at all. And if you can use it and you have a fair algorithm, you will identify, even if you leave behind a lot of patients, you can identify maybe some of the more advanced ones, there's going to be an incremental gain. Whereas on other indications, the AI theme, augmenting the picture a little bit or augmenting the histology a little bit, I think the incremental gain from implementing that technology at that level is less. And that's why, in general, I agree with her statement there, and I'm supportive of this. And again, we've made one of those algorithms that in parts at least has been published at this time.
I was just going to keep on the same theme, having listened to the conversation there. And Alina's right, but the AI, I was listening to the podcast that you did with Jeff Lazarus and Jörn the other week, and this whole aspect of the coordination of care and multimorbidity. The potential for me for AI for liver disease is should you diagnose somebody with cardiac condition, you run a background liver screen for an AI because they've got a risk factor. If they're diagnosed diabetic, it goes on a pathway. You don't have to do it before, but once you hit that, you may want to integrate it into the pathway. This patient should now be checked for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Methotrexate use. This patient should be screened for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Rather than screen everybody, there is opportunities in multimorbidity care to add it to a pathway that once that patient triggers a pathway, this is an additional a FIB4, an IS4. Should it be X, they get elastography or something similar. We can rule out and rule in a more specific way using the AI back reading of these patient groups. I think Jeff Lazarus was also saying something very similar in that conversation, which interested me. And you did that beautiful piece when you came on the podcast about your AI back reading, and it was AST that was actually the better indicator, I think, in your study, wasn't it, Sean?
Yeah, well, that again relates to the disease stage. The more advanced they are, the more severe the fibrosis burden is, the higher AST or the ratio AST-ALT drops. The entire discussion around implementing these technologies and spending money on expensive tests is at this point, if I look into the German system, misses the target because we're not at the point where there is the perception that the disease is there and should be managed actively. And I think we've discussed this a number of times too. And now the AI can help you because it supports the physician even if he's not thinking of the indication. And again, a strength that I see in the entire discussions around the differences in the medical systems and the referral systems. In the NICE system, those referral pathways are very clearly defined and physicians are working according to them. They have to do it according to certain triggers and values. Now that limits the medical decision making because you have to do certain things or you can't do certain things. But on the other hand, if it's implemented, it will work. And it's a little bit more freestyle in the German system where you can make that decision or not, and the referral pathways are not as strictly implemented. I think there's medical care in both systems in their own way, but I don't see as strict referral pathways in Germany. I think a lot of patients are being left behind, even if they have abnormal tests and if they have a significant finding. And that's something that's worrisome to me. And I've been thinking about, how could that be improved? AI is one thing. CME is another thing. And this is, Roger, looping this back to you and your questions in the beginning. This is why I would like to be on this podcast, because I think the disease is out there and it needs to be addressed and it needs the attention. And if you ask me, where should we go next? I think we got to reach out beyond the experts field and actually start talking to physicians that do see these patients, but maybe do not have the same degree of expertise with regards to testing and treating at this time.
Well, now you're getting into the formation of SurfingNASH.com and a whole bunch of other issues that I'm happy to come back to in a minute. But before we do that, just we're aware of your interest in public health through the work you're doing with Jeff that you kind of found your way into, and you've explained that process. And the questions that we're talking about right now, what are the other research interests that you spend your time on?
My lab that I'm maintaining in Maïnz, and we're still doing a fair amount of basic science work, is looking at inflammatory liver cell injury, mechanisms of liver inflammation. We're looking at cytokine signaling pathways and their role in mediating, for example, insulin resistance from the liver perspective. So we always ask the question, what's the relevant role the hepatic compartment in model? Sometimes it's mice does play, and we're trying to identify these pathways that are potentially druggable from the liver perspective. And, having Scott Friedman here on the podcast has been really exciting because parts of the work that we'll be doing with colleagues in Maïnz are addressing those mechanisms of fibrogenesis.
I've got tons of questions about AI, but tonight is not about AI. If you had to say what the legacy in the future would be, what is there one thing that you really want to resolve? One area barrier, just the gold pinnacle.
So the obvious barrier in this field is that we define liver inflammation by looking at liver tissue, and we're going to disconnect it by identifying a blood-based biomarker, the troponin of the liver, if you'd like, that tells us this patient is at risk of fibrosis progression and needs treatment. I think this is a theme in every second podcast here. We need to dissociate the disease from the histological gestalt of the person or of the liver biopsy. The second thing is I think we'll have treatment available. I think we'll have medications within, let's say, 2 to 3 years approved in the indication of either fibrosing liver disease from NASH in advanced disease, and to be able to offer that treatment to patients that are progressing today and reaching end-stage liver disease. I think this is going to be the major breakthrough, and it'll be very exciting to see the podcast evolve towards that, hopefully not so far off day in the future that we can then prescribe medicine.
I think it's an interesting comment about medications. Earlier in the podcast, when there were studies that were put into play in significant number before the pandemic and in the belief that OCA was going to get approved, we actually had more drug studies to talk about. Recently, because of those two phenomena, things have either slowed up or not gotten started. So I think we've had less. My expectation is that will pick up again in the coming year, and we'll be able to spend more time talking about drug development, although the other things certainly should not be excluded. I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to go back to Jörn's comment about broadening the sweep of the folks we're talking to more broadly into treating physicians and some of the implications of that. But if you come out of pharmaceutical marketing, which I do kind of, you understand that the challenge of a new medication or a new disease paradigm is that you're dealing with people who are very intelligent, very short on time, and who tend to be what Myers-Briggs or the old Jungian models would have described as sensing and judging, which is to say they want discrete bits of data where the data tells them what to do or leads them based on what they know to know what to do. And fundamentally, when you bring a new disease to the table, you're trying to make time where it's challenging to make time exist, as Jörn pointed out already, and now we're back at greet 'em, treat 'em, and street 'em. But you also need to change the internal processes by which people evaluate data that's available. One of the terms I've heard used in marketing is that, they say in life you never get a second chance to make a first impression. But in fact, a lot of what I think we're working to do for the liver as we go into physician communities is exactly that, to make a second first impression, to say fundamentally, this is what we knew, but now we know more. And what we know now that we didn't know then changes how we look at what we've got. So I've never had this conversation with either of you two. Is that a sensible model to you? And then depending upon the answer to that, it's either yes, and here are the most compelling points we've got, or I would think about this a little differently, and here's what I think about. Let's share this with the audience one way or another.
Sure. I'm gonna give it a quick answer because I've been talking more, and then let Louise think about what she has to say about this. I think this is really making a strong second impression. It's not about the first impression. The first impression, this is a very frequent disease. It's difficult to tell from the outside who is the relevant patient. So as a drug marketer or as a drug developer, and I'm not in drug development, of course, you could say, if I don't know who to treat and I treat everybody, my response rate is 20%. I'm not going to get high reimbursements for this drug development. It takes a long time to do the drug, and then you have an endpoint that's shaky at times or has some uncertainties. So that's maybe an indication that carries risk. But the second impression in this is that today we are in a much better position to actually find the relevant subgroups. So it's not 30% of the population. It's the 1% of the population that have advanced disease, that develop endpoints, relevant endpoints that are detrimental for the patients. And these need treatment. And these endpoints can be prevented if you have a drug that's efficacious. Here, the second impression will come to that conclusion. There's a high unmet need. It's a druggable disease, and the impact for patients and lives is tremendous.
I absolutely agree with Jörn on that. There's a different aspect. When you talk to people who aren't patients, who come to have a look at their liver, most people don't know much about their liver. And when you engage, and we do obviously FibroScan and transient elastography, it is a first impression. It's a first impression how important that organ is in their life. It's a first impression as to how important that organ is in their future life, because we can glean an awful lot with liver fat. It was interesting listening to Jörn and Jeff talk about the bubble. I think you asked them to, they put more words in one bubble than I would ever put in a... These bubbles were massive. My one thing for the bubble was fat is dangerous in the liver. There is no simple fat, or fat is not simple. It's certainly not benign. So I was keeping it short because I was thinking while you were asking that question, they'll come up with something short. Oh no. I use the phrases with the members of the public that I scan, or even the patients that I scan, is the fact your body thought your liver was so important it was the only organ that regenerates. It's got live in the title. And we just keep it simple. Going back to Stephen's keep it simple, stupid, let's bring it down to basics. It is the only organ that our bodies, when we were genetically developed, was made to regenerate. But that's actually in there lies the problems that we have in getting a liquid biopsy with new tissue, with the way it works. It's not designed to show us it's got a problem. So we do have to go hunting slightly for that needle in the haystack. For me, with people that we scan and the education and then to engage them in their health, it is about the first impression of how to do that. Because hopefully most of these people with simple steatosis won't end up being patients either of endocrinologists, of cardiologists, or hepatologists. So, but from another standpoint, the work that Jörn does in the primary care, and we've got several great examples in the UK, in Nottingham and Southampton, you enrich the population of knowledge within a primary care area. You then get better referrals. You find the right patients and the density. That's the skill set, is that when we put liver specialists or nurse specialists into the community settings, they don't have to be there forever. What they aim to do is give that impression, educate about who should be screened, who should be scanned, the higher risks. And then the GPs roll on with it themselves. They take ownership of that. So it's enriching that body as the gatekeepers, as the delta, as Jörn said. So I think there's so much work that can be done that means that they would automatically think liver. I use the phrase, if in doubt, rule it out, don't rule it in. But we're a long way from that. We've got a long way to go, but we have come a long way. That's the key. So hopefully that addresses some of it. But it's both a first and second impression for me, particularly with some of the patients.
And again, I think it's much easier these days to make a strong second impression. And, we said that phrase a number of times. Primary care physicians don't have time, but they are so motivated to do the best for their patient in the available time. And if we educate them on the relevance in a well-defined subgroup, we don't have to tell them that they need to check everybody for liver disease and they're going to shake their head. But if it's the 1%, or let's say the 5% in their population, a subgroup in the diabetic patients, they will do this just to provide good care to them. And it's just, we need to empower them and give them the tools they need to care for these patients and identify them.
Yeah, I think that last point is really important. One of the phrases I use a lot on this podcast is that people do what's inspected, not what's expected. So it becomes easy to treat diabetes if what you're going for is glycohemoglobin lowering. And it becomes easy to treat dyslipidemias if you know that LDL is really what you're looking at. It becomes easier to treat things where you've got simple target metrics. And by the way, part of the nature of sensing, judging personality types is give me a data point. Give me the data point that tells me what I need to know. So I think one of the problems that the liver has had is that there is no data point. I mean, that's the reason for my idea of the swear jar for calling AST, ALT liver function tests as compared to liver enzymes, is that it's too easy to call them a liver enzyme test and then treat their normality or abnormality on a plus minus 2 standard deviation curve as what we're looking for, but that tells us nothing about what we care about. One of the reasons I'm attracted to the idea of AI as a background tool is anything that can produce a single data point. I'm going to go where Jörn was, which is I think primary care docs want to do the right thing, and they are short on time. So if you can give me a number, a metric, a simple thing I can look at and say, okay, I've got to focus on that in this patient, then that is the place where you start to have impact. And I don't know, Jörn, whether it matters, whether it's 5% or 55%, if in fact you can prove that you really are going to have impact by looking at it, that I think remains to be seen. But I do agree with you, the rest, fundamentally what you're saying, for those reasons. And then how do we do that with primary care physicians in a podcast, or with the endocrinologists or a gastroenterologist?
You got to reach out and get them on here, Roger, and we should discuss it with them together and just get their insights and hurdles. And by learning from each other, the tools will be refinable. And then in the end, to the best of our patients, we'll use those to diagnose the relevant cases. And that's another thing about the podcast. I think it really is a source of continuous academic discussion where ideas are emerging, or you get to reflect on some some of your thinking, and instead of, writing it down in your paper or not being able to discuss it with your colleagues, the podcast really is an arena where you can go back and forth and exchange and get some other thoughts on. So again, I think this is one of the motivations for me to support you in this.
Thank you. And the other thing I'm going to note is that we have just about finished building our information infrastructure. We will be populating it for the first time in the next couple of weeks with physician targets, just basically physicians to reach out to and see what we're doing. And it'll be interesting to see how much uptake we get and how quickly. Because in the absence of drugs and the kind of promotion that comes along with drug company budgets, it's hard to see what happens when you reach out to the vast endocrinology or primary care, but even forget primary care, let's just do endocrinology for a minute and see how much engagement that community wants to have in this disease. We're about to start learning that, and we'll be doing that through the pilot series that we're running in endocrinology that I've been talking about, and we'll be talking on Tsunami about some of the results of that and what that tells us about how to educate and reach out to the community as well. So I'm personally really excited about that, and I'm delighted that that's one of the things you chose to focus on today, because I think going forward, to make a real dent in this disease, we've got to start educating physicians as well as the communities we're talking to already. Okay, I'll do my typical closing question. 12 months later, what do you envision and hope will be different about the podcast or the reach of the entire Surfing NASH franchise?
From my perspective, Roger, you've done a great job in building this, and you just entered into year 3, so I think the numbers do tell their own story. I'm certain that this brand will grow, and I would think that maybe this going to transform into a CME type of educational series at one point, where physicians then go to get update on certain indications or certain tests and maybe get more listeners in. I think, there's something you started. So maybe in 12 months, this will be a regular feature of this podcast.
I was just thinking, A, along those lines, but B, along the lines of where we started at the beginning of the session. We were talking about the multi-comorbidity work that Jörn does. Is that the podcast potentially is a forum to develop that multidisciplinary network and discussion. Bring in cardiology, bring in endocrinology. We're obviously bringing in endocrinology with the 4-part series. But to have that discussion in the open forum, to have the barriers discussed as to where we need to go. We've got patient advocates, we've got patient groups, we've got donor. So again, to give that forum, and I think that's the exciting part of where we can go in the 3rd and 4th year, because it's becoming stronger across that base. So that excites me, because out of that, again, you break down the barriers, it's entertaining, it becomes fun, it's educational, and we can open those discussions in a way that we never could before, obesity management, things like that. So I'm very excited about where it can go, certainly in that multi-morbidity care management aspect.
So the broader vision, right, and this is a tad ambitious, but what the heck, is to have a series of CME, really, or educational podcasts targeted at different subpopulations, and then to find people who are attracted to that and want to learn in that and start to expose them to Tsunami, which will be really what it's been, maybe a little bit more broadly, more primary care, a little more multi-comorbidity, but a place where people are talking about cutting-edge ideas, whether it's about new drugs, new tests, AI, better thoughts about patient management, that this becomes that place, and that we have a whole satellite of educational tools around that for the different specialties or subspecialties, or frankly, patients who want to start to engage this disease on a different level. That will be the thrust of the next couple of years, and I'm really excited about it. I share both of your enthusiasm. With that, let me note that it's 1:45 in the morning in Sydney, where Louise is, and we scheduled 45 minutes. We're at the end of that time right now. So, Jörn, Louise, closing thoughts for this interview? Or everyone go first.
Well, my closing is, I'm a regular on this podcast now, and happy to join you. Looking forward to the next year. There will be more in-person meetings, so it might well be that we're recording from all different parts across the world, depending on where that meeting might be on a Monday evening. But I think it won't lead to a situation where the podcast is being lost. You said it was founded in the context of not being able to meet and exchange, but I think the way it has built over those last 2 years, it's one pillar of exchange of ideas around diagnostics and treatment options for NAFLD. So I think it's a good time and fun. And again, thanks for onboarding me.
You're welcome to be onboarded, and we will all be in Barcelona together. So you never know, we might have to do a Sunday recording. But I'd like to welcome you onto the podcast. I always love it when you come on, but you will have to find a football team to join Roger and I in the discussion. You can have Maïnz.
Yeah, I think you can buy Bayern Munich really cheap this week, by the way.
They're in pain because they lost the match. Normally they win every game, so I think I would want a little bit other. The Maïnz, again, I'll think about it, and I'm following German soccer.
The rules.
Yeah. But I get the impression I'm not at the level that you guys are.
First of all, on this podcast, with all due respect to Dr. Harrison, we call it football. He can call what we play in the States real football, but we call football. It's what I played in high school. My closing comment is really simple. I love what you brought to this podcast. The breadth of thinking, the integrating all that public health and primary care and clinical research and costing and that broad vision. I think as we move forward, that will be really an excellent thing to have with us at all times. People like the episodes that you're on. They do well. We get good feedback. And as we broaden out our view of what we're trying to achieve, I can't think of a better person to have along with us. It's our pleasure to onboard you. In fact, we are honored by your willingness to be onboarded. They desire to be onboarded, honors us. And we will see everybody on the 25th, which is a week from Monday for our next recording session. In the audience, that's the 27th, which is the date that will drop when we're taking a look at the 5th Global NASH Congress. Louise, get some rest. Jörn, have a great vacation next week, and we'll see you all soon. Bye-bye now.
There is no business section this week, but don't forget to join us tomorrow for our regular weekly episode, which features interviews with Global Liver Institute President and CEO Donna Cryer and newly recognized AASLD Fellow Naeem Al-Khouri. Until then, stay safe, surf on, and we'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.